Hello again, everybody. Look, I get it. I really do. I understand that a lot of you are really on edge these days with your investment portfolio in the midst of all this uncertainty that's going on. So let's put things in perspective, because I think that's going to help you understand that maybe things aren't as bad as they appear at first glance. We're going to have a little fun this week. Well, as much fun as you can have talking about, major bear markets and corrections, but I am going to give you my top 5 worst market experiences of my career. And it's going to be interesting to see how they compare and contrast to your own personal experiences. And I think by the end of this episode, you're going to learn something here, because we can always learn from the past, and really importantly, how it can compare to things that are going on right now. So, without further ado, we'll take these in reverse order, starting with number 5. Number 5, 1994 municipal bond implosion. Wow. That was an incredible voice. We need to find out who that is and maybe hire that guy. Golden voice. Anyway, yes, more than 30 years ago, the municipal bond implosion that started out on the West Coast and then spread its tentacles across the fruited plain. It was out in Orange County, California, and it was all of this rogue treasure, if you will, started off this record-setting sell-off and traveled, like I said, across the country. Now, this rogue treasure had no business being in charge of a county that size. He didn't know what the heck he was doing. He had no experience. And a lot of people got into trouble for even hiring the guy. He basically blew through $1.6 billion of taxpayer money because of some bad trades. That'll get you fired, won't it? In fact, it'll put you in handcuffs. There he is. That's the guy, Robert Citrone, who ignored all kinds of rules and regulations. He was even consulting, we found out later, by the way, psychics and astrologers for guidance. The dude was facing like 14 years in prison, but he did plea bargain it down to just a year. And he also had 1,000 hours of community service, if I remember right. But I learned back then, early in my career, that even the so-called safety of fixed income and bonds, and in particular, even AAA insured bonds, can still suffer in value. And that's exactly what happened in my little corner of the world as I was starting to build up this muni bond portfolio early in my career. That was the lesson that I took to this day, that you always need to be careful that even the safest of investments, something can go wrong if you're not keeping watch. Number 4, 1997, 98, and 2011 emerging markets meltdown. Yeah, number 4, I'm cheating a little bit. I'm adding 2 dates to this, kind of a 4A and 4B, but they're joined at the hip because they all started with emerging markets. First of all, back in the kind of mid to late 70s, the emerging markets were starting to fail a little bit. It was starting to show up in their markets. And something that seemed very innocuous at the time, the ground zero back then was in Thailand, and their currency, the baht. Now, you might think, really? What kind of big deal is the currency in Thailand? Well, it turned out to be a major deal in global markets because their devaluation had this cascading effect that really spread not only emerging markets but around the world. So by 1998, the very next year, here in the U.S., a very large hedge fund known as Long-Term Capital Management went belly up. And they had their tentacles in various markets around the world. So the fact that they went under was starting to really worry the Fed. They had to get involved. Meanwhile, stock market, bond market, especially the stock market, not doing well at all. Now, that connects us then more than 10 years later, 2011, emerging markets again. This time, ground zero was in Greece. You may remember that. That seemingly inevitable bankruptcy that was going to happen roiled the markets, and it looked like we were perhaps going to go back into another great recession because we were only just a couple of years out of it. And there was still this fear that at any moment we could go right back into it again. We were that close. So I think the lessons there are you can't just look at the U.S. in isolation. You do have to think globally, and don't pass off something as sort of a non-event just because it happens in the emerging markets. You have to kind of watch the ripple effects from that. Number 3, 2000 to 02 internet bubble bursting. Yeah, the third worst bear market in my career. I know a lot of you remember it well. The inglorious internet stock mania coming to an end. And at the time, it was the worst bear market since the Great Depression, as the tech-heavy NASDAQ crashed, get this, 77%. The S&P itself was cut in half. And the lessons that I learned there have really stayed with me for obvious reasons, where you learn to separate a lot of the hype and the hope and, dare I say, hysteria from the facts at hand. And you can't follow the crowd. I did a podcast on that, how you have to be very, very careful. We even threw in some old experiments a little bit where you have to be very careful and you just have to kind of stay in your lane and stay true to your principles. So please go back and take a look at that. But that was, at that time, like I said, the worst bear market since the Great Depression. And a lot of investors still have scars from that day, but hopefully they've all learned from them. Number 2, March 2020, the pandemic. Well, moving on, you knew this had to make the top 5, right? You talk about panic among investors and on Wall Street. Wow, this one had it all and then some. The S&P crashed 35% in just 5 weeks, the fastest in history of that magnitude. And I love that picture, by the way, very descriptive, I think, of the virus rolling across the world and destroying financial wealth in the process. And in a recent weekly commentary, I wrote about that very thing, that policymakers have to be very careful because you start messing in certain areas of things that you've never been before, and that can unleash these dark forces that nobody saw coming. When you actually shut down a world economy that's worth more than $100 trillion and think that that's not going to have any long-term ramifications, you're fooling yourself. And we stayed too long at the party. We gave too much money and put too much money into the system. I even wrote about that back in my weekly commentary. I was very public at the time. The first stimulus package was fine, but we kept adding on to it, and we're still paying the price for that in so many ways. Now, before we go to my number 1 worst bear market experience of my entire career, I want to add in an honorable mention. Honorable mention, Black Monday, October 19th, 1987. Yeah, I can't really add this in my top 5 because I was not managing money at the time, but I was still connected to that day in another way. In my previous career, as many of you know, I was a TV news reporter, eventually became a sports reporter. But back in 87, I was working at the CBS TV affiliate in Wichita, and I was wearing a couple of different hats. I had the government beat, which was kind of boring at times in Wichita, Kansas, but also the finance and investing beat, which was kind of interesting to me since that was not my original background. Well, guess who got the assignment to cover it locally, that Black Monday market crash? Me, because that was my beat, of course. And I'll never forget it. I walk into a Merrill Lynch office to do the story. Now, keep in mind, I don't know a lot about that world, but I was struck. It was palpable at the time, the panic that was going on, not just by investors who were outside wanting to see their advisors. You probably wouldn't get that as much today because everything's online. But back then, physically, people were showing up and their phones were just ringing off the hook and the advisors didn't know what to do. And I'm thinking the human element of this is really fascinating to me. And it has stuck with me to this day. All about investor sentiment. To me, that is the most powerful force than any single report about inflation or anything like that. You get consumer and investor sentiment right, and you will do very well as an investor. Now, with that said, we now go to the worst bear market in my career. Drum roll, please. Oh yeah, there it is. Here we go. Number 1, 2008, the Great Financial Crisis. Yep, no-brainer, right? You knew this was going to be number 1 because it really is the greatest bear market outside of the Great Depression. And it was really still coming off that internet bubble bursting that we talked about. So we had these back-to-back bookends of 2 really bad bear markets, but this was the worst. When you look at the worst single trading days in history, do you realize if you look at the 23 worst days, 10 of them occurred in a 2-month period there in the fall of 2008. That's incredible. In fact, here they are right now. Obviously, we don't look at points. It's more relative to look at percentages. So there they are through late September into early December. And I remember coming into work in those days and taking a seat at my desk and then just feeling like Mr. Market was punching me in the face over and over again. And I'm just sitting there going, thank you, sir. May I have another? I mean, those were some really bad days. And so let me tell you, my friends, what we're going through now, and I think you would agree, if you lived those days and you truly remember how rough they were, nothing quite compares to that. Now, I make no predictions. I'm not saying that whatever we're going through today can't morph into something more ominous. But all these years of experience that I've had, you do start to get a feel of when things are starting to break and where we could be heading. And as much as I think we could be in potentially for a correction or could be a bear market, I don't see the infrastructure breaking apart and the mistakes being made. I really don't. That would maybe make this one of my top 5 in the future. We shall see, fingers crossed. I know hope isn't a strategy. So, my friends, I'll leave you with this. You just have to live within your own plan, right? You have to live within your own goals, and you also have to live within your own risk profile. Prudence is always the thing that you have to remember, and flexibility. We are being prudent and flexible on our end, and I recommend you do the same from your end. Hey, look, I would love to know your own experiences of your worst 5 if you're a long-term investor. Not only subscribe, please, but leave a comment. You can always ask a question. I will engage. Of course, no buy, sell, or hold recommendations, but everything else is fair game. So have at it, all right? Make it a great rest of your week. We'll talk to you again next week. From now, Dave Simons signing out.